This is Father Joseph Anthony Kress.
And this is Father Jacob-Bertrand Janczyk.
Welcome to Godsplaining. Thanks to all who support us. If you enjoy this show, please consider making a monthly donation on Patreon. Be sure to like and subscribe to Godsplaining wherever you listen to your podcasts. Well, Father Jacob-Bertrand, we are back at it.
Here we are.
Look at us. Look at us. No, it's good. And I'm excited about today's episode because this episode is coming out of, honestly, a great discussion from one of our retreats earlier this year.
Yeah.
It was a topic and something that you presented, but led to fantastic discussions with the retreatants throughout the rest of the conference, or the retreat, I should say.
Yeah.
So today what we're talking about is the capital vice of envy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's many different forms, or it's kind of contemporary way that it rises up in this society, but it is something that is extremely, I think, kind of misunderstood too. So as we dive into envy, like, if you could just give us a baseline, like, what is the understanding of the capital vice that is envy?
Yeah, so to get a sense of like what envy is, we have to look at the spiritual tradition as a whole, and where the spiritual tradition, the Catholic tradition, comes from is sort of part and parcel. They come together, or at least the deadly sins and like tradition that is like the Catholic spiritual life. They kind of rise together out of the desert tradition. So we look back, like, first centuries of the church, even before monasticism or religious life was established, you had the desert fathers who went out to the desert to escape the world, to live a life devoted to sort of penance. Right, they had like these weird penances, the basket weaving and like
standing on poles.
Yeah, exactly.
Like the most ridiculous one.
Yeah,
I thought
like,
it was like
these weird things, but they were all aimed at like unity with Christ and removing distraction from everything else. So you have people like Evagrius and Pachomius too, right? It's a little bit later, and then also, but probably most popularly known, John Cassian, who kind of brought this desert. John Cassian in particular brought this like desert wisdom back to Europe, really. And it was in that where, from Evagrius and then Cassian, where you had this development of these ideas of these deadly vices or these capital sins, as they later became called. And there were 7 of them, or there are 7 of them, as they've been distilled through the tradition. And of the 7, there's lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy. That's our topic today, and pride.
Yeah.
And if you look at, as the centuries went by, Gregory the Great talked about these in a particular way, and then St. Thomas does, of course, in the Summa, and Thomas relies on the tradition of Gregory and Cassian. So this is where it's coming from. And one of the things that, and the sort of theme here, there's 2 with the capital vices, sins, deadly sins. One is that the Desert Fathers saw that like penances were good to what, like, fight external temptations. So you would like fast so as to like deal with like external temptations against lust, for example. But there also needed to be spiritual exercises to weed out like these spiritual vices. So that's one. And then they're called capital vices because they're not so much sins. They can be sins in themselves, right? But they engender sinful behavior. Yeah. So if we look like lust, well, you can say I sinned against lust, but like lust creates a way of living, a lustful way of living.
Right.
And the same way the virtues do, right? You live a chaste life. You can do chaste things, but it's also a whole way of living. Yeah. So think of this in like the bad side of it. Yeah. So we start there, at least generally.
Those capital vices, and they're the kind of photo negative of the virtues.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
And they do have these like daughter vices that fall underneath those categories, and that's why, you know, they're called capital, because they're head, but then from those spawn all these other little vices. And so that's kind of like the quick overview of what we're looking at. But let's dive into envy. You know, because it's I this is my own personal thoughts and feelings of it, but I think it's probably one of the greater the more confused of these capital vices. So when we're talking about envy, you know, in the tradition, what do they actually hone in on? So what does it actually end up getting explained as?
Yeah, so we'll look at two, at least for the sake of two people for right now. We'll look at Cashin, one of the desert, the guys in this desert tradition, and then Thomas. Mm-hmm. So Cashin, when he talks about envy, he talks about envy, and he does in numerous places. So like citing one place, it's kind of a theme here of the Desert Fathers. So it's not, you can look in one place, but we'll just do a general thing, right? Cashin understands envy as what he calls like a food of the mind that corrupts the mind. And it is a sort of, he talks about becoming wretched or miserable in the face of another's prosperity or goodness.
Ooh, okay.
So yeah, it's rough there, right? He's not joking about it. So it's a vice. It's a way, envy changes the way you see reality, according to Cashin. Particularly in light of looking at a good that somebody else enjoys or has, and it makes you miserable or wretched.
Yeah.
Right. So then Thomas talks about the seven, and envy being one of them, as capital sins. This is where we get from the deadly sins to capital sins. And he talks about envy as a sadness at another's good. Right. So we can look at the world around us. I could look at you and say like, oh, you're good at X, Y, and Z, and that's great.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, all of that. Not A, B, and C, just X, Y, and Z.
Just X, Y, and Z. That's all I got.
That's right. Yeah, just three. So you're good at these things, and we have options. I have options of how I want to react to that. I could say like, that's awesome. Mm-hmm. Good for him. I could say, I don't really care. Like, there can be indifference. That's not envy. Or even saying like, I wish I were good, you're like, if you were a great basketball player, like, oh gosh, I wish I had those skills and I could like work to have them, not as a way of like, that makes me sad, but that like inspires me. That's not envy either. But if I looked at your great basketball skills and was like upset by that, like that made me sad, and then because it's a capital vice, right, it inspires me to behave differently towards you. I might gossip about you to ruin your name. I might take joy when you have a bad game. Like those kind of things. When I become sad that you have something that I want, that's envy. That's what we're talking about. That's what Cashin's talking about. That's what Thomas is talking about. That's what we're talking about today. But that's what the tradition is telling us. It's a grief at another's good, and then it makes us act in ways that are destructive towards us and others. Yeah. So that's what we're talking about, really.
That is, I mean, I don't know. I think that kind of definition, that understanding, changes things for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Because I think far too often envy is just approached as jealousy, right? But when you start to look at it within the tradition, understand that it's grief, it's sadness at another's goodness.
Right.
That is so kind of counter our experience with God, right? Whose goodness is diffusive of itself.
Yep.
So then to be saddened of somebody else's goodness, which means how they are maybe glorifying the Lord, right? It's sad of their goodness, of maybe how they are making God known in this world, is in that way really an offense against the Creator.
Yeah.
And that's really kind of earth-shattering sometimes. That it's not just the sadness, but it's true grief of another's goodness. And that can be really, like you were talking about, it can be so destructive, because then it engenders all these other sins about detraction and gossip and all those things. And we both know how many times we're sitting in the confessional and we hear all these daughter virtues, and we're trying to tie them all together and say, actually, you're probably struggling with a little bit of envy. And to kind of hone in on that it's that sadness at another's goodness, which is different than just sadness at another's like success too. And that has its own flavor to it. But when you actually boil down, when we're talking about envy, it's the sadness of another's goodness being made manifest, and maybe your engagement with that. So we don't want to be sad at each other. We actually want to encourage and rejoice with each other. Which is something that's exciting. I think something that's actually specifically Christian, but that's for later down the road. But let's talk about, and I know one of the big things that you kind of spoke about on our retreat, which I was so happy that you did, but starting to bring envy into the kind of contemporary context.
Yep.
So like, how does that look in kind of our current engagement with it, because we're not all in the desert, and we're not all like weaving baskets just to destroy them.
That's right. Yeah.
If you are, you probably need to talk to somebody.
Good for you, but
you know. But how does it translate into this modern society and its contemporary context?
Yeah, I think the crux there, and I think first, I think you're exactly right in that we can look sometimes, like we can read things like spiritual authors or things from a particular time period or whatever, and think like, yeah, there's some modicum of truth there, and I could see what they're getting at, or like I don't get it at all, or like this what I'm describing now, like, yeah, I kind of get it, but I'm not like you said, I'm not weaving baskets in the day. Like it just might be harder to relate. But I think the key sort of thing that keeps these deadly sins, especially envy that we're talking about, relevant relevant and contemporary is not so much like a definition from Cassian or Aquinas, but this idea that they put forth in that it augments reality. Not that it augments our perception of reality.
Right.
Like it doesn't change what is, but it changes our perception of it, and therefore our interaction with it. So what I like to think about here is, okay, to keep this kind of fresh, not to change it, but to keep it fresh in our minds, is I like to talk about envy less as envy and more as comparison. Because you mentioned like being in the confessional, right? And hearing this under different lights. And I don't think you need to hear confessions to have this experience. Like we can just talk with our friends, with people that we know, and or even like our own experiences, and look at the way we behave, and like, yikes, I acted out in this way. I drank too much. Well, like why? Well, because like perhaps I looked at somebody else and like I'm disappointed that I'm not that. Like it's tough to deal with me sometimes. Me dealing with me. So this kind of numbs it. Like we do these behaviors, or like when we go to pray around other people, we go to make a holy hour, and like we're constantly looking at what other people have, and then we're discouraged by going, they pray so well, or they look,
spiritual envy. It's real.
It's real.
It's one of those things that is so subtle. Gosh, is it subtle? But it really is something that can destroy a healthy prayer life. It can destroy one's relationships with each other and one's relationships with God. So I'm so happy you brought that up, because that's probably one of the areas I see it most explicit, is that kind of spiritual envy of maybe I need to pray harder, I need to do what they're doing, or have that type of relationship, and that's not necessarily the case. So anyway, I jumped in there, and I went on a whole another thing,
but it's this thing of reality that you're describing. And I think, and in my thinking about this, okay, what does this do? How does envy distorts the mind when I see, it affects the mind such that my perception of reality is distorted when I see a good that somebody else has, or that I think they have, right? How I perceive it. So in thinking about that, I think there are like four kind of connected, sequential things, pitfalls that go with comparison and envy. Okay. And we'll talk about them.
Let's break it down
briefly. Yeah. Great, perfect. So the first is that it's a distraction from God.
Yeah.
And this is primary. It's first because it's first on my list that I've made up, but it's also primary because it's what the Christian life is about.
Yeah.
Right? That we're focused on God. Come whatever, that our focus is on God. And I often think here of St. Peter, and when the apostles were in the boat and Christ came out to them on the sea, when he walked on the sea and during the storm, like our Lord invited Peter into the storm. He didn't calm the storm at first. He invited Peter into it to be there with him where Christ was in the storm. And Peter could be there with him so long as what? So long as he focused on Christ. When he began to become panicked and look at the waves and look at the storm, that's when he began to sink. Now, Christ still reached out his hand and lifted him up, but it's this focus on God that helps us. So envy is a distraction from God, right? Because the whole of our lives is supposed to be about God perfecting us, but we have to be there. We have to be there. And when we enter into this envy, it's a comparison. It's comparison that becomes this distraction.
Yeah.
We're now focused on, okay, Father Joseph Anthony, he's doing this and I'm not. So, who am I thinking about now?
Yeah.
Father Joseph Anthony or me.
Yeah.
But not God.
I mean, I love, there's so much to pull away out of that story of Jesus inviting Peter to walk on the water, but you're like, he invited him into the storm, but he got distracted by the waves and all that. And that's exactly what this envy is, to get distracted.
Right.
And thus we're not focused on Jesus.
Yeah.
And that is, I mean, as you're talking about that, I was like, oh my goodness, we've talked about this how many times, but like to make that connection, to see that it's by getting distracted by the things that are kind of assaulting or attacking, the waves are, I don't think they were small waves.
Yeah, it was a storm.
It was a big one. It was a big one. But to see how those distractions and how envy does take it, and I think you meant this, like it augments our perceptions of reality so that the distractions become larger than what they are, and God becomes smaller.
Yep.
And that's problematic.
That's true.
So understanding that one of the kind of pitfalls of envy, or how it's shown, is that when you're constantly distracted or constantly looking at other things that are like not being related back to the Lord, or being related back to your relationship with him, that can be like horribly detrimental.
Yeah.
So, all right.
And that leads to two, right? Yeah. That leads to two. To enter into this world of comparison, we have to become like the creators of that world, right? That we have to kind of set the parameters of what like goodness is. Mm-hmm. We have to sort of like comparison in order to compare in this kind of negative way. And I'm not saying you can't like make real comparisons about things, but to be sucked into the vice, right? It means that I have to say like, this is actually what I think is good. And now this person is either doing it or not, and I'm reacting to it. Because if we were actually looking at what the reality is, we would rejoice in goodness, But like here, I've set up my standards of if people do A, B, and C, that means they're good. This person has A and B, and I have C, and I'm jealous of A and B. Like I've set up what A, B, and C are, or at least like holiness is A, B, and C. Well, maybe it is, and maybe it isn't. Mm-hmm. But I'm the arbiter of goodness and these kind of things. And again, this is a distortion of reality.
Yeah, it's that kind of who's setting the criteria for these judgments. You kind of threw it out there, but I want to circle back to that, is the fact that like, because we are rational beings, we have an intellect, and that's a gift. Like we end up making comparisons
all the time.
It's part of our intellectual capacity. I don't think animals do that. Right, it's specific of those that have an intellect, is to make that kind of comparison and to render judgments. But then the follow-up question to that is, well, how are you judging?
Right.
Are you judging in accord with created reality as intended by the Creator, or are you judging, comparing what is good and what is not to what you think?
Right.
And we can get into, I'm sure I know we have episodes on this. Maybe we should do more. I don't know. But aspects of relativism.
Yeah.
And I think, that's always in the background, if not on the foreground of a relativistic society, is how insidious envy is in that, because you're positing your own criteria on what is good and what is not. And so now I'm comparing according to me.
Yeah.
And that's what this is all about. Me. So.
Yep. And then that's the third point here, right? So the first is distraction from God. The second is I have to set up the terms of like reality. The third corresponds to the second, in that like we always have insufficient knowledge of like the whole of something that we're looking at, whether that's another person, whether that's like what another person is doing, whether that, whatever it means. Like we could look at somebody who looks super pious in a holy hour and think, I wish I could just be attentive like that. You have no idea what's going on in their mind. You have no idea. And hopefully it's holy and great thing, but you have no clue. No. You really don't. And even when you do have ideas of things, even with people that you know better, there's still insufficient knowledge to like. And this is why like I'm kind of reticent to say like we shouldn't. No, I'm always reticent to say, but to talk about this, I'm reticent like that we shouldn't judge. Judge not lest you not be judged. Well, what is the Lord talking about? He's not, because like you said, we're human beings, so like that's how we function. We perceive something, we judge whether or not it's good, and we go after it. And our Lord is saying, don't make judgments. You should know them by their fruit. Like this is how we judge. But it's like the state of one's soul that that we're not to judge. Right. So we ought not like bring that into our comparison game, Well,
if I remember correctly, now this is me not being a scripture scholar and definitely not being a linguist. My skills in languages. Okay, there it is. That's what I wanted to see. But if I remember correctly, the translation is not judge, but condemn. Condemn not, so that you not be condemned. And that changes it, right?
That certainly changes it.
That certainly changes it. Yeah. But I understand you're reticent for that, saying, well, we have insufficient knowledge, so we shouldn't judge. But getting back to what we launched off with, right? What is envy? Sorrow at another's goodness. So not that we say, like, we have insufficient knowledge so that we shouldn't judge. It's actually we have insufficient knowledge because we shouldn't be that grief-stricken at another's good.
Right.
Like when we see or when we start to compare, like, let us not be grief-stricken because we don't know the entirety of a thing. So let's see the good that we see and rejoice in that, but let us not then dive into anything else.
Right. Yeah, and I think this brings us, it does bring us to the fourth and final point. So distraction from God, we create the parameters that's based on insufficient knowledge. The fourth is that we end up in this still distortion of reality, is that we no longer engage with real human beings.
Yeah.
Because again, it's on our terms, and we set up so people become sort of figments, not totally, but in part of our like imagination, of our fantasy of whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. People become less of a person, and more as sort of an object that we use to compare.
Yeah.
We don't engage with the reality of a person. We engage with our perception of the person.
Well, it's not we engage with the perception, but we engage with the character that we created in our head.
Yeah.
You used a line in there, and I was kind of super happy you did that, but it's like we live in a fantasy.
Yeah.
And that might be a whole nother theme I haven't really thought about, but I picked up during that retreat, was the fact that so many of these capital vices force us into a fantastical way of life.
Yeah.
And not a real engagement with creation and a real engagement with the other or God himself.
Right. Well, ultimately, God himself, the person who we most create a fantasy with. And then we wonder why we're disappointed when we think God's not giving us what we need. Well, no, God's not giving us what you want in this sort of fanciful kind of thing. Now, I don't think we all live in a total fantasy, but the vice is a vice for a reason. This is something that we deal with in our own kind of ways. So,
yeah. You mentioned a few. Maybe we got just a few minutes left rolling in here, under 10. But you mentioned how there are some kind of concrete steps, maybe, that if you are a person that struggles with envy, you're a person that struggles with sorrow at another's goodness. If they're sitting there like, yep, that's me, I got that. Like, what advice do you give? What kind of concrete steps can you say, okay, let's start to roll that back a little bit now and step into it?
Yeah, so I think the remedy is just this is perhaps not like the best kind of answer, because I'm giving the answer just as the contrary to what I've said is the illness, as it were, right? So the illness being a sort of fantasy. So I think the remedy is entering back into reality, especially with like ourselves, because this is the comparison game is me versus whatever. Right. So it's entering, I think, a reality too of what I am, of who I am, and to recognize that I am, a beloved son of the Father, and that's it. And like you said, our Lord, the Father is sort of like this rejoicing at goodness, not the sorrow at goodness. Like this is the point of creation, of my existence, and sort of praying for and remembering that like God's love for us is unconditional. Like holiness is not a conditional thing. Like if you're only if, like I said before, that ABC, like you only have C on that list, if you get A and B, then somehow like God will love you, like God will make you. That's not the point. So okay, what do I say more concretely? I think two virtues stand out here to counteract, and one is humility. That's usually attached as the remedy to pride, but I think it's helpful here. And the other is gratitude. So humility, why? Well, it's just like reality with respect to ourselves. That's what it is, right? Humility is not the sort of beating up of oneself, but it's recognizing that who I am, that I'm not God, and that God is God. Really, like that, I think, is a super simple way to approach it. So, we can practice ways of humility. I think, I don't remember who, I'm sure it was at some point in formation that we were told, don't pray for humiliating things, like humility will come on its own, like careful what you wish for kind of thing. We can pray to be made holy, but I don't know, I'd caution, like don't pray to be humiliated, like careful what you
I have hot takes. I'm not a big fan of the litany of humility for a variety of reasons. No, I'm not going down that road. But yeah, you really don't encourage people to pray for humility, because then they wonder why like they get humbled real quick. And anyway, that's a whole nother issue. But to be able to recognize and to like reconnect with yourself in the reality of it, like, oh my gosh, I have strengths, I have weaknesses, that's okay. And there's a beauty in that too. So humility was the first one.
Gratitude is the second. So I think at least with humility, last thing I'll say about that is like, pray for like, I think the ability to live humbly rather than to be humiliated, right? Okay, great. Gratitude. Why gratitude? Well, because we have to take stock of who we are to live in reality. Yeah. And that includes like the gifts and the good things that God has given each of us. And if we're unable to recognize like how it is that we contribute to the kingdom, and to the building of the kingdom, then like, of course we're going to look at other people and say like, well, I wish I had that. But when we do that, again, we're ignoring the talents, the gifts, the beauty, the beautiful things that our Lord has given each of us uniquely to us, that he wants to use in his bringing souls to him. So I think like, we're often encouraged to like make like an examination of conscience in the things that, in the ways that we failed, but like an examination of gratitude might also be something to incorporate into our prayer, into our lives.
I've encouraged a lot of our students to do examination of gratitude, like just every day write down 3 things that you're thankful for that 24 hours. Another piece of advice that maybe incorporates both, that I would throw out there, and I don't know if it's worth it or not, but we'll find out. It's kind of dangerous, but I would say don't be afraid, because when we're talking about envy and we're talking about the sorrow at another person's goodness, a lot of times that's rooted in this like misperception that you don't have goodness. Yeah. You know, that you yourself are not good, and that you're looking at everybody else's with sorrow because they have something that you don't. So I would say that it's okay and maybe a laudable exercise to ask a trusted friend the simple question of what is good about me. You know, if you're struggling with your own goodness, and
it takes a little courage, but why not?
And if they're a trusted friend, if you would trust their advice on anything, like, hey, what's this business decision, where should I go on vacation, you know, what prayers do you recommend, but you trust them on all these other aspects, you ask that simple question, what's good about me, you got to trust their response. And I've found a lot with students, young adults, but really it's kind of just all over the place. I found that people don't know their own goodness. Yeah. And it takes a third party, another voice, to be able to speak that to them. That often doesn't happen, so they just don't believe they're good.
Yeah, it festers.
It festers. Yeah. And that's where, if you're bold enough to have that courage to say, hey, I'm kind of struggling, but like, not as this weird like, hey, just affirm me, you know, all that kind of stuff, but to be able to like ask that as an honest and legitimate question of like, hey, you know, just what's good about me, and trust that response. On the kind of, maybe that was 1A, but like with the 1B side, I think we need to do a better job of telling people their own goodness. So when you see goodness in somebody else, to speak to it. Yeah. Right?
Like authentic affirmation kind of things.
Just like, that is so fantastic. Like, that is such a beautiful thing. Like, I love your laugh. Like, it's infectious. Like, keep laughing that way, you know? Just little things like that can just do a world of good to just slowly build up people in their comfortability with goodness. Yeah. So that when they encounter their own goodness, they're not afraid of it. But also when they encounter somebody else's goodness, that they don't become sad. And don't become, you know, roll down that envious path, and then we lead to detraction, gossip, and distraction. Okay. Yeah. All right. Any last words? What else you got on envy? Any last things and partying shots and things like that you got?
I think that we have to be okay with, I don't know, with not having exactly what everybody else does. Yeah. And we live in a culture and a world that, like, to be validated, we have to be the same. Like, we have to have the same phone and like the same kind of nice car, and but it's like, and I have to be the same sort of level of success. It's just like, if that's what we, you know, fine. Like, if you want to be competitive and like naturally, like good, like and those sort of things. But like, if that's the sole source of our worth, it's like, we're always going to lose. So just to reiterate, like the things that you said, like, yeah, we should take stock of the good things that we have, and if that requires like a conversation with or conversations with friends and stuff, we should treat each other well in order to, like, I was going to say journey along the way together. That's a little cliche, but you know what I mean.
As if you were like on a pilgrimage or on the Camino or anything like that, right?
Oh yeah, that was a while ago now.
I know,
I'm trying to forget.
It's all good. It's all good. So thank you so much for listening to this episode of Godsplaining. Please follow on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Like this episode, subscribe on YouTube or on your podcast app, and please leave a 5-star review for us. If you'd like to donate to the podcast through Patreon, follow the link in the description or the show notes. There you can also find links to our shop for our merchandise, as well as to get information on upcoming Godsplaining in-person events that we're hosting. So thank you very much for listening. And I always say, please share this episode with those that you think would benefit from it. This one might be a little dangerous if you share that with somebody that you think might be struggling with envy. So I'll leave that up to you. But thank you for listening and sharing. Know that we are praying for you, and please keep praying for us. God bless.